The candles at Harlow Park numbered in the hundreds that evening, and every one of them seemed to lean toward Lady Serena Blackwell, who sat at the Duke's right hand in a gown the color of crushed pearls, with seed pearl beading at the bodice that caught the light each time she breathed. At the opposite end of the table, 14 chairs and a lifetime away, Catherine Sinclair Ashworth held her soup spoon with a grip that would not tremble and watched the footman pass her by with the second course, without pausing, without even glancing at her plate, as though the place setting at the far end of the table were decorative rather than occupied. She was the Duchess of Harlow. The household preferred to forget it. 3 months married, and the silver at her place was the everyday pattern, not the family set that gleamed before every other guest. Her gown was muslin, plain and cream-colored, with sleeves she had let down twice, and a hem she had mended herself the previous Tuesday, with thread that did not quite match. Among the silks and embroidered shawls and jeweled combs that filled the dining room, she looked like a letter delivered to the wrong address. The Dowager Duchess, Lady Philippa Ashworth, presided from the center of the table with the serene authority of a woman who had never once been made to sit at the wrong end of anything. Her hair was dressed high and powdered in the old style. Her diamonds were the Harlow set that Catherine had never been offered, and her posture communicated a single unbroken message to every person in the room. She had arranged the seating herself. Catherine knew this because Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper, had told her so that afternoon, with the careful neutrality of a woman who had chosen no side and intended to keep it that way. What Mrs. Graves had not said, and what Catherine had understood anyway, was that every guest in the room had been invited to observe a duchess who did not belong. She straightened her shoulders against the chair back. The wood was hard, and the cushion was thin, and she was fairly certain the chair itself had been brought from the morning room, since the dining chairs had arms, and this one did not. The candlelight caught the thin gold band on her left hand, the only piece of jewelry she had carried into this marriage, and even that felt borrowed. 14 guests, a table that could seat 30, crystal that rang when the footman set down the decanters, and at the far head, Edmund Ashworth, the Duke of Harlow, cut his pheasant without looking up. He was 32 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair cut short, and a jaw that the candlelight rendered in hard lines. He had not looked at her once during the first course. He did not look at her now. His hands were precise on the knife and fork, and his conversation with the baronet to his left was clipped and civil, and revealed nothing. And yet when Lady Serena leaned close to murmur something against his ear, her gloved fingers brushing his sleeve, his knife paused, his jaw shifted, his gaze lifted, traveled the full length of the table as though tracking a sound no one else had heard, and found Catherine's face for exactly 2 seconds before returning to his plate. 2 seconds. She felt them in her throat like a swallowed stone. His eyes were gray, and in the candlelight they were the color of smoke from a fire that had not yet decided whether to burn or to die. She looked away first. Her hand found her napkin. Her pulse was doing something unreasonable beneath her wrist, and she pressed her fingers against the linen until it subsided. If you have ever been the only person in a room who noticed the one thing that mattered, then you already know what those 2 seconds would cost them both before the autumn was done. The terms had been delivered to her father's solicitor in a letter bearing the Harlow crest, a heavy red wax seal that smelled faintly of cedar, and no warmth whatsoever. Catherine's father, Mr. James Sinclair, had died the previous November, with £4,000 of debt secured against a house that was worth perhaps half that sum. He had been a country gentleman of modest means and immodest kindness, the sort of man who lent money to his tenants and never recorded the loans as debts, who rode out in the rain to inspect a collapsed fence because he could not ask a man to repair what he had not seen himself, and who kept a small leather account book in his breast pocket, with columns of figures in his careful slanting hand, and margins crowded with notes about crop rotation, timber quality, and the particular needs of individual families. Catherine had found the book in his coat after the funeral, tucked behind his handkerchief, the leather warm from his body. She carried it still, inside the lining of her traveling case, though there was nothing left to account for. The creditors had taken the house in February. The furniture went at auction in March. Her mother had died when Catherine was 9. A fever that came in the night and was finished by morning. And the memory of her was a scent of lavender, and a voice reading aloud by firelight that Catherine could almost but not quite reconstruct. There were no brothers, no uncles, no cousins with means. What remained was a name in good standing, a wardrobe that filled one trunk, and a woman of 23 who could manage a household, keep ledgers, settle disputes among tenants, identify rot in a timber frame at 40 paces, and read a field for drainage the way other women read a face for feeling. Because her father had taught her every one of those things in place of the son he never had. None of it mattered. What mattered was that the Duke of Harlow required an heir, and his mother had identified Catherine Sinclair as a woman of adequate breeding, adequate health, and no leverage whatsoever. The offer arrived through a man of business named Mr. Thorne, a thin solicitor with careful hands and a voice that never rose above the conversational. He had laid the terms on the table in the rented room where Catherine was living on the last of her father's credit and explained them without apology. She would marry the Duke. She would bear an heir. She would receive an annual settlement of £300. And when the heir was delivered and weaned, she would retire to the dower house at Grandon, 12 miles from the main estate, and live there quietly for the rest of her natural life. Catherine had read the terms twice. She had pressed her thumb against the wax seal until it cracked in a clean line down the center of the Harlow crest. Then she had signed, because there was nothing else. And the nothing else was a kind of freedom that felt exactly like falling. At Harlow Park, the east wing became hers. It was handsome and cold, furnished in the style of the previous century, with heavy curtains that smelled of camphor and a writing desk whose drawers stuck in the damp. She took her meals there on a tray. She walked the grounds in the early morning, when the household was still asleep, and the dew was heavy on the grass, and the only sound was the rooks in the elms along the south drive. She learned the names of the gardeners, the stable hands, the cook's 2 daughters who carried wood to the kitchen before dawn. The elderly footman called Jennings, who had served the family for 40 years, and who alone among the staff addressed her as Your Grace, without flinching or looking at the floor. The rest called her nothing at all, or when they believed she could not hear, they used the word the Dowager had coined in the first week. The arrangement will take her meals in the east wing, Lady Philippa had said to Mrs. Graves in the corridor outside Catherine's door, her voice carrying with the precision of a woman who did not care whether it carried or not. See that she has what she needs, not what she wants. There is a difference, and the difference is the family silver. Catherine heard the rain before she saw it. She had risen at dawn to walk the south meadow, a habit her father had given her, and the only hour of the day that felt like her own, when the sky opened without warning, and the lane to the tenant cottages became a river of mud in minutes. The September rains had been building for a week, and the ground was already saturated, and when Catherine crested the low hill above the cottages, she could see the damage before she could hear it. The roof of the Burrows cottage had caved on its eastern side, a long diagonal collapse that had taken out 2 of the main joists and sent a cascade of broken thatch and splintered timber into the room below. Martha Burrows was standing in the yard with her 3 children and a goat, all of them soaked, the youngest child screaming against her hip. the eldest boy holding a blanket over his sister's head with the grim determination of a child who has been told to be useful and intends to do it. Catherine ran, her shoes filled with water in the first 10 strides. Her gown wrapped itself around her legs, and she pulled it free without slowing. By the time she reached the cottage, her hair was streaming and her hands were already on the timber, testing the frame the way her father had taught her, pressing her palm flat against the beam to feel for the gyve that meant rot versus the firmness that meant salvage. The eastern joists had failed. She could feel it in the grain, the soft, fibrous surrender that meant the wood had been damp for months, possibly years, and no one had inspected it. The western half would hold until evening if someone braced it. "Thomas," she called to Thomas Hargrove, who had come out of the neighboring cottage in his shirt sleeves with an axe over his shoulder. "I need rope and lumber from the stable. Your son can fetch it faster than I can. And I need Martha and the children inside your cottage, by the fire, with something warm to drink." Hargrove looked at her, this mud-covered woman in a ruined gown who was giving instructions with the authority of someone who had spent her life giving instructions exactly like these, and he nodded once and did as she asked. Within the hour, Catherine had rigged a tarpaulin over the collapsed section with the help of Hargrove and his 15-year-old son. She had braced the western joists with timber from the stable and secured each joint with rope knotted in the manner her father had shown her for temporary field repairs, tight and doubled, with the tail tucked so it would not slip in the wet. She was still on her knees in the mud, tying the last knot to a stake she had driven into the ground with a mallet borrowed from Hargrove's tool shed, when the shadow fell across her hands. She looked up. Edmund stood at the edge of the lane. He was coatless. His shirt was soaked through and pressed against his chest, and his boots were heavy with mud, and his face held the particular stillness she was beginning to associate with him, the stillness of a man whose thoughts moved faster than his expression was willing to show. He had come on horseback, and the horse stood steaming behind him in the rain. He said nothing for a long moment. His eyes moved from the rigged tarpaulin to the braced joists, to the knot she was tying, and she watched something shift behind his face. A recalculation, as though a figure in a ledger he had been keeping had suddenly changed. "Come inside," he said. His voice was low and level, the way he spoke to his steward. "You are soaked through. The rope needs a second anchor, Your Grace." "Come inside, Catherine." It was the first time he had used her given name. She heard it land in the rain between them like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples went through her body before her mind could catch them. Her hand stopped moving on the rope. Her pulse climbed into her throat. She rose, mud on her knees, mud on her palms, rain in her eyes, and followed him to the Hargrove cottage without another word. Inside, he handed her a blanket from the chair by the fire without touching her fingers. He stood by the window and looked out at the rain and the ruined cottage and the tarpaulin she had rigged, and his jaw tightened in a way she was beginning to recognize as thought rather than displeasure. His hand moved briefly to his waistcoat pocket, where something small and flat pressed against the fabric. Then he dropped his hand. "You braced those joists correctly," he said, still facing the window. "The previous steward would not have managed it. My father taught me." "Your father," he said. And the word seemed to cost him something she could not measure. That evening, a crew of 6 men arrived at the Burrows cottage with new timber and instructions from the estate office to replace the entire roof before the week was out. No one told Catherine who had sent them. No one needed to. The house party began on a Friday in late September, and Lady Philippa managed it like a general managing a campaign she expected to win by Saturday. 20 guests arrived in a procession of carriages that filled the gravel drive for the better part of an hour, each one discharging silks and trunks and valets and ladies' maids into the entrance hall, where Jennings received them with the weary patience of a man who had seen 40 autumns of house parties and expected 40 more. Lady Serena Blackwell came last, in a barouche lined with blue silk, wearing a traveling dress of deep rose that made her skin look like porcelain and her confidence look like architecture. She was beautiful in the way that certain buildings are beautiful, proportioned and finished and designed to be admired from every angle. Catherine could admit this without resentment, the way one admits that a winter storm is beautiful when watching it through glass from a warm room. Lady Serena had golden hair dressed high with pearl-headed pins, a laugh calibrated to carry precisely to the ears it was meant for, and the particular assurance of a woman who had been told since childhood that she was the correct choice for every room she entered. The Dowager had chosen her 3 years ago, before the arrangement, before Catherine. The entire house party was an argument rendered in crystal and candlelight, and Lady Serena's perfect posture at every meal. At dinner that evening, Lady Philippa seated Serena at Edmund's right hand for the 3rd time. Catherine was placed between a minor baronet, whose primary conversational subject was his spaniels, and a widow from Hampshire who had come for the shooting, and who spoke to Catherine with the careful politeness one extends to someone whose situation is understood to be temporary. It was Lady Serena who spoke the word aloud, turning it from a private cruelty into a public fact. She waited until the table was quiet between courses, until the footmen were pouring the claret, and every ear was available. And then she said, in a voice warm and generous and perfectly aimed, "I do not fault His Grace for the arrangement." She smiled at Catherine down the length of the table. A man in his position must think of the succession. One does what one must. She paused, and her gaze traveled to Catherine's plain muslin gown, to the thin gold band, to the everyday silver. The arrangement serves its purpose. 14 guests heard her. The baronet cleared his throat and looked at his plate. The widow from Hampshire studied her wine. Nobody looked at Catherine. Catherine's fingers tightened on her napkin beneath the table, the fabric bunched in her fist, and she kept her face composed with the discipline of a woman who had been keeping her face composed for 3 months and intended to keep it composed for as long as the keeping required. At the head of the table, Edmund set down his wine glass. The base met the cloth with a sound that was not loud and was somehow audible above the silence. He looked at Lady Serena, and his expression did not change, and that was the change. He turned to the footman standing behind his chair. "Move Her Grace's place setting," he said, in that same low-level voice that never rose and never needed to. "She sits beside me." The footman hesitated. Lady Philippa's hand froze on her glass, her diamonds catching the candlelight in a spray of cold fire. The silence held for 4 heartbeats. Catherine counted them against the pulse in her own wrist. Then the footman gathered her setting, the everyday silver, and the water glass and the small bread plate, and moved them to the chair at Edmund's left. She rose from the far end of the table and walked the full length of the dining room under the gaze of 20 guests, her chin level, her shoes worn at the heel, her gown plain among diamonds, and sat in the chair beside the Duke of Harlow, as though she had been sitting there her entire life. Edmund did not acknowledge the change. He resumed eating. His elbow was 3 inches from hers. She could feel the warmth of him through the sleeve of her gown, and she understood nothing, and her body understood everything, and her hand trembled once against the stem of her glass before she stilled it. The nursery was on the 3rd floor of the west wing, behind an oak door that had been locked since before Catherine's arrival. She found it on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, following a corridor she had not yet explored, drawn by the quality of the light through a tall window at the end of the passage. The window looked west over the park, and the afternoon sun came through it at an angle that made the dust in the air visible, suspended and golden, as though the corridor itself were holding its breath. The door was dark with age, and the lock was a heavy iron mechanism that had not been turned in years. A fine line of dust lay along the threshold undisturbed. She did not try the handle. She pressed her palm against the wood the way she pressed her palm against timber, and she felt the cold of an unheated room on the other side, and she knew without being told what the room had once been prepared for. She was still standing there, her hand flat against the door, when Edmund appeared at the end of the corridor. He stopped. The afternoon light caught him in profile, and she saw his hand move to his waistcoat pocket with a gesture so automatic it might have been reflex, his fingers closing around the outline of something small and flat beneath the fabric. A key. She could see its shape. "Do not," he said. The word was quiet and absolute. A single stone dropped into the golden air. "Your Grace, I was not attempting to enter. I only wondered what was behind the door." "I know what you were wondering." He came closer. The corridor was narrow, and his shoulders filled most of it, and Catherine became aware of the distance between them, with an exactness that made her breath shallow. 3 feet. 2. He stopped with less than an arm's length between them. She could see the pulse in his throat, above his cravat, steady and deliberate. And she could feel her own pulse answering it. "My wife," he said, and stopped. He had never used the word before. Not at the wedding. Not in the weeks after. Not in any conversation she had overheard. It hung between them in the narrow air like something fragile, and possibly dangerous. "My first wife, Eleanor. She died in this room. 4 years ago, in the winter. The 23rd of January. Catherine did not speak. She held herself still and let him find the words at whatever pace they came, and she kept her hand at her side, and she breathed, and she waited. The child died with her. A son. He lived for 3 hours. The midwife said he was strong, that he fought. Edmund's voice did not break. It simply thinned, drawn finer and finer like wire under pressure, until the sound it produced was barely sound at all. I was in London, attending to a debate in the Lords that I had been told could not wait. The express reached me 2 days after. I rode through the night. I arrived to a house that was already in mourning. His hand was still at his waistcoat pocket. She could see the key pressing against the cloth, the shape of a small thing that had become the heaviest thing he carried. She understood then, with a clarity that felt like a bruise forming beneath her ribs, that the arrangement had never been about coldness. It had been about fear. He had built a contract instead of a marriage, because a contract could not die in a locked room while he was somewhere else being important. He had written disappear into the terms, because disappear was what Eleanor had done. And if Catherine disappeared by design, then at least it would not be a surprise he could have prevented. If you have ever watched someone carry a weight they believed they deserved, you will recognize what Catherine saw in his face in that corridor. Not cruelty, not indifference. A grief so disciplined it had become indistinguishable from both. She reached out and touched the back of his hand, very lightly, with 2 fingers. He flinched. He did not pull away. The warmth of his skin was startling against the cold corridor air, and she felt it travel through her fingertips and settle somewhere behind her ribs, and for a span of 5 or 6 heartbeats they stood in the narrow corridor with the locked nursery behind them, and the October light falling through the window. And neither of them spoke, and neither of them moved. And the silence was the most honest thing that had passed between them since the day they were married. The Dowager made her announcement on the Thursday evening, with every house-party guest still in attendance, and Lady Serena positioned at her left hand in a gown of midnight blue with silver thread at the collar, that made her look like something painted by a master whose commission had been to capture perfection and who had succeeded. Lady Philippa rose from her chair before the dessert was served, with the composed authority of a woman who had rehearsed the moment in front of her dressing mirror and was satisfied with her rehearsal. "I wish to share with our guests," she said, her voice carrying the length of the table with practiced warmth, "a matter of household planning that I know will interest those who care for the future of this family." She paused. The pause was calibrated. Her Grace the Duchess will shortly be removing to the Dower House at Grandon, where she will find every comfort appropriate to her station. The arrangement, as our friends are aware, was made with practical ends in mind, and it is only fitting that once those ends are met, the household should return to its natural composition. She smiled. It was a smile that expected agreement the way gravity expected objects to fall. Lady Serena lowered her eyes with a modesty so perfectly timed it was indistinguishable from triumph. At the far side of the table, near the window, a woman Catherine did not know, a Mrs. Pemberton from Wiltshire who had attended for the cards and the gossip, leaned toward her neighbor and said in a voice calibrated to carry just far enough to be overheard, "They say she is merely the arrangement, nothing more than a vessel for the succession. The Duke will have his proper Duchess before Christmas, mark my words." Catherine sat very still, the candlelight pressed against her face. She could feel the heat of it on her cheekbones and the cold of the room at her back. And between those two temperatures, her body held itself in the particular rigidity of a woman who is deciding, in the space between one breath and the next, whether she will break or whether she will stand. She looked at Edmund. He was watching his mother with an expression she could not read. His hands were flat on the table, his wine untouched, his jaw set in that hard line she knew now as thought rather than anger. He did not speak. He did not contradict. He did not look at Catherine. The silence from the head of the table was a silence Catherine had heard before. From her father's creditors. From the solicitor who had read her the terms of the house sale. From every man who had the authority to intervene and chose instead to let the sentence land where it would. She waited 3 heartbeats for him to say something. He did not. She set her napkin on the table. She stood. The chair scraped against the floor, and the sound was sharp and small and final, and every eye in the room followed her as she rose. "I will go," she said, and her voice was steady and clear and addressed to the room. "I will go willingly, and I will go tonight if it is wished. I was told the terms when I signed them, and I accepted them, and I have no claim to more than I was promised." She paused. She turned to Edmund. Her eyes found his across the distance of candlelight and crystal, and she held them, and she saw something move behind his face that might have been recognition or might have been pain. "I have only one condition. I will not bring a child into a house where it learns that love is a contract to be fulfilled and then forgotten. If you want an heir, Your Grace, you will have to find another arrangement." She walked the length of the dining room for the second time. This time, no one moved her chair. This time, she walked through the door with her back straight and her shoulders level, and her vision blurred with something she refused to let fall from her eyes until the door was closed behind her, and the corridor was dark, and the only witness was the portrait of the first Duke of Harlow, who had been dead for 2 centuries and could not judge. In the east wing, she pulled her traveling case from beneath the bed and began to fold her clothes with the precise efficiency of a woman who had packed before, who had packed when the creditors came, who had packed when the house was sold, who knew exactly how little she owned and how quickly it could be made to fit. Her father's account book was in the lining. She pressed her hand against it and felt the shape of his handwriting through the leather, the columns and the careful slanting figures and the marginalia about drainage and timber and the names of tenants he had treated as neighbors. And she closed her eyes, and she breathed, and she did not weep, because weeping was a luxury she had spent 3 months learning she could not afford. The autumn ball at Harlow Park fell on the last Saturday of October, and the Dowager had planned it as a coronation. The ballroom was the same room where Catherine had first been seated 14 chairs away. The same hundreds of candles, the same family silver on the sideboards, the same gallery of faces arranged in the same hierarchy of chairs and standing places and relative proximity to the Duke. Lady Serena wore ivory silk with a diamond clip at her throat and stood beside the empty space where the Duchess's chair had been. Lady Philippa had ordered the chair removed. Its absence was louder than furniture. Catherine was not supposed to be there. She had packed her case. She had arranged passage on the morning coach to Bath, where a distant school friend had offered her a room until she could find a position as a governess or a companion, which was what women of good breeding and no fortune became when the alternative was the street. She had written a letter to Mrs. Graves thanking her for her neutrality, which was the closest thing to kindness the household had offered, and she had sealed it with wax from her own candle, because she did not presume to use the Harlow crest. She had been crossing the entrance hall toward the front door, her case in her left hand, her father's account book pressed against her palm because she had moved it from the lining for the journey when she heard the music from the ballroom. A waltz and laughter, the particular quality of laughter that meant something was being celebrated at someone else's expense, and she had stopped, and she had known, with the certainty of a body that has memorized every slight a house can deliver, that the celebration was the fact of her leaving. She walked into the ballroom. She did not knock. She did not announce herself. She wore the same plain muslin gown she had worn at the first dinner, the mended hem, the sleeves that were slightly too short, and she carried her traveling case in her left hand because she had not had time to set it down. The room noticed her in stages. The violins continued, then faltered, then steadied again, as though uncertain whether the music should accommodate this intrusion or pretend it had not happened. Conversation thinned and ceased. Heads turned. Lady Philippa's hand tightened on her glass until her knuckles whitened beneath her rings. Lady Serena's smile faltered for the first time since her arrival, a small fracture in the certainty that only Catherine was close enough to see. 80 guests. The same witnesses who had watched her walk the length of the table in her plain gown 3 weeks ago. The same candles. The same hierarchy. Catherine stood in the doorway and breathed. Edmund was across the room. He was standing beside the fireplace with a glass of claret he had not touched, and his face was the face she had seen in the corridor outside the nursery, the face of a man carrying a weight he believed he deserved. And when he saw her, something behind that face collapsed, not into weakness, not into sentiment, but into the sudden, terrible clarity of a man who has just understood what he is about to lose and what it will cost him to keep it. He set the glass on the mantel. He crossed the ballroom floor. 4 strides, each one deliberate, each one audible against the parquet, the hard sound of boots on polished wood, while 80 guests and his mother and Lady Serena and the footman who had moved the place setting and Mrs. Graves in the servants' doorway and old Jennings behind the wine table watched him walk toward a woman with a mended hem and a traveling case in her hand. He stopped in front of her. The silence in the room was the silence of a held breath multiplied by 80, a silence so complete that Catherine could hear the candles guttering in their sconces and the fire settling behind the grate, and her own heartbeat, and, beneath all of it, the faint sound of his breathing, steady, deliberate, the breathing of a man who has made a decision and does not intend to unmake it. "Catherine stays," he said. His voice carried to every corner of the room. "She is my wife. There is no arrangement." 9 words. She counted them the way she had counted his heartbeats in the corridor, and each one landed with the weight of a door being unlocked after 4 years of silence. Behind him, Lady Philippa's composure fractured. Her lips parted. Her hand fell from her glass. She looked at her son with the expression of a woman who has built a structure out of confidence and custom, and the absolute certainty of her own judgment, and is watching it come apart at the foundation stones. And for the first time in Catherine's knowledge of her, the Dowager Duchess had no prepared sentence, no polished correction, no hierarchy to invoke. She was simply a mother who had underestimated what her son was willing to lose. Lady Serena turned her face toward the window. Her reflection stared back at her in the dark glass, and the diamond at her throat caught the light once more. And something in her posture shifted from confidence into the quiet, private reckoning of a woman who has just discovered that the room she was designed to occupy has chosen someone else to fill it. Mr. Thorne, the family solicitor, stepped forward from beside the column near the card tables. He had been standing there all evening, a thin, quiet man with careful hands and a document he had been holding since before the first waltz. "The terms of the original settlement have been dissolved at His Grace's instruction," he said, addressing the room with the flat authority of a man who dealt in facts and did not require anyone's approval to state them. "The Duchess of Harlow holds full rights to the household, the estate, and the family name. There is no dower house provision. There is no condition of any kind." The room exhaled. Mrs. Graves, in the servants' doorway, pressed her hand to her mouth and held it there. Old Jennings, behind the wine table, straightened his coat, adjusted the cuff of his left sleeve, and nodded once. The kind of nod a man gives when the evening has finally, at last, produced the outcome he had been waiting for since the day the young Duchess arrived with one trunk and a thin gold ring, and the bearing of someone who deserved better than the welcome she received. Edmund took the traveling case from Catherine's hand and set it on the floor beside the door. He did not make a speech. He did not explain himself to his mother or to the room or to the 80 guests who were watching with expressions that ranged from surprise to satisfaction to the quiet private pleasure of people who have just witnessed a verdict they had been waiting to hear. He offered Catherine his arm, and she took it, and her fingers settled against the wool of his coat, and she felt the warmth of him beneath the fabric. And they walked together into the ballroom, while the violins resumed and the candles steadied in their sconces, and the house, for the first time since Catherine had entered it 3 months ago, felt like a place where she was supposed to be. Later that night, when the guests had retired and the music had stopped, and the ballroom was quiet except for the sound of the fire settling in the grate, Catherine sat in the chair beside Edmund's desk in the main study. Not the east wing, the heart of the house. A fire burned low in the grate, and the light from it moved across the walls and the leather spines of the bookshelves and the portrait of Eleanor that hung above the mantelpiece, a young woman with kind eyes and brown hair and a small mouth that looked as though it had been smiling when the painter asked it to be still. Catherine looked at the portrait for a long time. She did not feel jealousy. She felt the particular tenderness of a woman who understands that the love she has been given was made possible by the love that came before it. Her father's account book was open on her knee, the familiar handwriting visible in the firelight, the columns of figures and the marginal notes about drainage and the names of families he had cared for. And she traced one of his annotations with her fingertip and thought of him, and was grateful, and missed him, and let both feelings sit together without requiring either one to win. Edmund was standing by the window. Snow had begun to fall. The first snow of the season, fine and slow, visible against the dark glass like something the night was confiding to the house. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and drew out the miniature she had seen pressing against the cloth in the corridor outside the nursery. It was small, no larger than his palm, an ivory oval in a gilt frame, and the face painted on it was the same face as the portrait above the mantel. Younger, softer, caught in a private moment the painter had been trusted to witness. Eleanor. He looked at it for a long time. Then he opened the desk drawer, placed the miniature inside, and closed it gently, with the careful tenderness of a man setting down something he had carried for 4 years, and was ready, not to forget, but to stop holding. He turned to Catherine. "I need to show you something," he said. He held out his hand. She took it. His fingers closed around hers, and they were warm, and the warmth was steady, and she held on. They climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor of the West Wing, to the narrow corridor with the tall window and the golden dust, to the oak door with the heavy iron lock. He reached into his pocket and drew out the key. He looked at her. She looked back. He turned the key in the lock, and the sound it made was small and clear, like a word that had been waiting 4 years to be spoken. The door opened onto a room full of moonlight and dust, and the shape of a cradle that had been moved from the window to the center of the room, as though someone years ago had been arranging the space and had stopped and had never come back. The snow fell beyond the window. Catherine stepped inside. She touched the cradle's edge with one finger and felt the smooth wood beneath the dust, cool and solid, shaped by hands that had expected it to hold a living child. She did not speak. Some rooms ask only to be entered and not explained. Edmund stood in the doorway. His hand was at his side. The key was still in the lock where anyone could turn it. "I was not here," he said quietly. "I know," Catherine said. "You are here now." The snow continued to fall. The cradle stood in the moonlight. And the door, at last, stood open. Thank you for staying until the end. If Catherine's journey touched something in you, leave a quiet word below before you go.